The Nexus spire smelled like recycled air and diplomatic anxiety. Theo Harver had been aboard the station for 3 weeks now, long enough to recognize the particular metallic tang that clung to the ventilation systems when the atmospheric processors were running hot, which they always were during summits. Hundreds of delegates from dozens of species, each breathing different atmospheric preferences, each sweating or secreting or emanating their own unique brand of stress pheromones. The station's environmental controls were doing their best, but their best smelled like burnt ozone and someone's distant lunch. Theo didn't mind. He'd worked in worse places. At least here, nobody was shooting at him. He wiped a smear of graphene lubricant from his hands onto his already stained work coveralls and squinted at the junction box embedded in the corridor wall. Panel 14C had been flickering for 2 days, and the station's quartermaster had finally cornered him in the mess hall to complain about it. Apparently, the Vetchin delegation found the inconsistent lighting spiritually destabilizing, which Theo suspected was their polite way of saying it annoyed the hell out of them. Fair enough. It annoyed him too. He popped the panel cover and stared at the nest of fiber optic cables inside. Whoever had installed this system had done it during the station's construction 40 years ago, and apparently decided that color coding was for amateurs. Every cable was the same dull gray, snaking through the housing like a bowl of particularly unappetizing noodles. Fantastic, Theo muttered. Love a good mystery. He pulled his scanner from his tool belt and began tracing the circuits, following the electromagnetic signatures one by one. Around him, the station hummed with activity. He could hear the distant murmur of the promenade, where the real business of the summit was happening. Handshakes and veiled threats, trade agreements and territorial disputes, all wrapped in the language of diplomacy. Theo had walked through there once on his first day, and decided immediately that he wanted nothing to do with it. Too many people pretending to like each other. Too many rules about who could stand where and who could speak first. Give him a malfunctioning power grid any day. He was 3 cables deep into his diagnostic when he heard voices approaching. Not the usual station traffic. These were lower, conspiratorial. The kind of voices people used when they were talking about something they shouldn't. Theo glanced over his shoulder. 2 figures rounded the corner, Kryn soldiers, judging by their mottled green skin and the way they walked with their weight forward, ready to spring. They wore ceremonial armor that looked uncomfortable as hell, all polished plates and decorative etchwork. Security detail, probably. The station had hired them by the dozen for the summit. They were speaking in broken universal standard, their voices gravelly and amused. Swear on the clutch mother I saw her yesterday, one of them said. Walked right past me. I nearly dropped my plasma lance. You lie, the other replied, but he sounded eager to be convinced. No one gets that close. I'm telling you, friend, close enough to see the way she moves. Like water, like. The first Kryn made a gesture with his clawed hands that Theo couldn't quite interpret, but the intent was clear enough. They don't exaggerate. The woman with the most beautiful ass in the galaxy. Theo bit down on a laugh. He kept his eyes on his work, but his ears were fully engaged now. The second Kryn hissed something that might have been a chuckle. You're obsessed. It's undignified. Undignified. Have you seen her? Even the Vetchin delegation stopped clicking their mandibles when she entered the hall. That's reverence, my friend. That's universal truth. They passed by without noticing Theo crouched by the panel, their voices fading as they continued down the corridor. He listened until they were gone, then sat back on his heels and grinned. The woman with the most beautiful ass in the galaxy. He'd heard rumors flying around the station, whispers about some mysterious dignitary or perhaps a celebrity traveling incognito. The galaxy had no shortage of famous people, especially in neutral zones like this. Singers, actors, socialites who made careers out of being seen. Apparently, this one had made an impression on the Kryn. That took something special. The Kryn were not, generally speaking, an easily impressed people. Theo returned to his work, but curiosity gnawed at him. He traced the faulty cable to its source, a burned-out relay that would need replacing, and made a note on his datapad. Then, on impulse, he decided to take the long way back to the engineering bay. The route would lead him through the edge of the promenade, where he could maybe catch a glimpse of whoever had the soldiers whispering like teenagers. The promenade was chaos wrapped in formality. Delegates moved in slow, careful orbits around each other, their conversations humming with subtext. Theo kept to the edges, where the service staff and lower-tier attendants circulated. He felt immediately out of place in his work coveralls, but no one paid him any attention. Engineers were functionally invisible at events like this. He scanned the crowd, looking for anyone who stood out. There were plenty of candidates. A Thalorian ambassador in robes that shimmered with bioluminescent patterns. A human trade envoy in a suit so sharply tailored it could probably cut glass. A cluster of Myrene delegates, their crystalline skin refracting the light into tiny rainbows. And then he saw her. She stood near one of the viewports, her back to him, speaking quietly with an attendant. Her robes were silver, flowing like liquid mercury, and they caught the light from the stars beyond the viewport in a way that seemed almost alive. Her hair was dark, pulled back in an intricate style that left her ears exposed, long, elegantly pointed ears that marked her as Illyrian. Theo had seen Illyrians before, but not many. They were a reclusive species, powerful but distant. Their empire controlled a significant chunk of the outer veil, but they rarely involved themselves in galactic politics. He watched her for a moment, trying to reconcile the whispers he'd heard with the woman in front of him. She moved with a kind of effortless grace, the kind that came from absolute confidence. He could see why the soldiers had been talking. He took a step closer, craning his neck to get a better look at the light panel above her. It was flickering too, same issue as 14C, probably. He made a mental note to check the relays on this level. And then, because the universe had a sense of humor, he backed directly into her. The impact wasn't hard, but it was enough to make her turn. Theo froze, his face suddenly warm. "Sorry," he blurted, raising his hands. "Wasn't watching where I was, didn't mean to. Traffic's terrible in here, you know. Should really install some lane markers or..." He stopped. Up close, she was even more striking. Her eyes were amber, flecked with gold, and they held his gaze with an intensity that made his rambling die in his throat. She smiled, just barely but enough. "Do you know who I am?" she asked. Her voice was low, measured, carrying an accent he couldn't place. Theo blinked. Should I?" The woman's smile deepened, and for a moment Theo thought she might actually laugh. Instead, she tilted her head slightly, studying him with those unsettling amber eyes. There was something ancient in that gaze, something that made him feel like a bug under a microscope, except the bug was also being offered tea. "Perhaps not," she said, and there was amusement in her voice now, genuine and unguarded. "That's refreshing." Theo opened his mouth to respond, possibly to make things worse, when the corridor did something he hadn't expected. It fell silent. Not the natural quiet of a lull in conversation, but the heavy, oppressive silence of 100 people simultaneously deciding that breathing loudly might be a fatal mistake. He glanced around, confused. Every delegate, every attendant, every passing station worker had stopped moving. They were all looking in his direction, or rather past him, at her. Then the guards appeared. They seemed to materialize from nowhere, though logically they must have been nearby. 6 figures in armor so ornate it looked ceremonial. Except Theo could see the plasma emitters built into the gauntlets, and the way the plating shimmered with energy shielding. Illyrian sentinels, if he remembered his xenology briefings correctly. Each one stood nearly 7 feet tall, their helmets covering their faces completely. And then, in perfect unison, they dropped to one knee. The sound of armored knees hitting the deck plating echoed through the promenade like a gong. And then everyone else started kneeling. The Vetchan ambassador, his insectoid legs folding in that peculiar way their anatomy required. The Thalorian envoy, his bioluminescent robes dimming as he bowed his head. Even the Kryn soldiers from earlier, their expressions somewhere between reverence and abject terror. Theo stood frozen, the only vertical person in a sea of genuflection. His brain was trying very hard to process what was happening and failing spectacularly. The woman he just backed into, the woman he'd made a stupid joke about traffic to, watched him with barely concealed amusement. "Still don't know?" she asked. "I'm getting the feeling I should," Theo managed. His voice came out higher than he'd intended. She extended her hand, not for him to shake, but in a formal gesture he recognized from historical vids. The kind monarchs made when they wanted you to know you'd really stepped in it. "Selira Vale Ithrin," she said. "Sovereign monarch of the Illyrian Empire, guardian of the Outer Veil, keeper of the Star Roads." She paused, her smile turning wicked. "And according to some, the woman with the most beautiful ass in the galaxy." Theo's brain shut down completely, just packed up its things and left. Somewhere in the back of his mind, a small voice was screaming, but it was very far away and getting farther. "Oh," he said. "Oh no." "Oh yes," Selira replied. The promenade remained silent. Theo was dimly aware that he should probably kneel or bow or possibly throw himself out the nearest airlock to save time. Instead, he just stood there, his tool belt hanging awkwardly from his hip, a smear of graphene lubricant still on his cheek. "I am so fired," he said, mostly to himself. Selira laughed. It was a real laugh, bright and unrestrained, and it seemed to shock the assembled dignitaries more than anything else that had happened. Heads lifted slightly, though no one dared rise from their knees. "What's your name?" she asked. "Harver, Theo Harver." "I'm an engineer, just an engineer. I fix things, lights mostly, sometimes climate control. I'm very good at climate control. Not good at, not bumping into galactic monarchs apparently." He was babbling. He knew he was babbling. He couldn't stop. Selira's expression softened slightly, though the amusement never left her eyes. "Theo Harver, when was the last time someone spoke to you without rehearsing their words first?" "I don't know, I mostly talk to machines. They're very straightforward, no protocol." "Well, communication protocols, but those are different. I meant me," she interrupted gently. "When was the last time someone spoke to me that way?" Theo closed his mouth. He thought about it. Looked at the kneeling crowd, at the guards who hadn't moved a muscle, at the woman in front of him who commanded fleets and controlled 70 star systems with a word. Probably not recently. He offered. "Not in 4 years, Selira said. 4 years of carefully measured responses. Of people who won't meet my eyes unless protocol demands it. Of conversations so thoroughly rehearsed that I can predict every word before it's spoken." She glanced around at the assembled delegates, her expression unreadable. "It becomes tiresome." One of the sentinels shifted slightly, and Theo caught the faint hum of a comm system activating. Someone was probably trying to figure out whether to arrest him or just shoot him and save time. Selira raised a hand, and the sentinel froze. "Tell me, Theo Harver who fixes lights," she said, turning back to him. "Are you attending the banquet tonight?" "The what?" "No, absolutely not. I'm not, I don't, that's for important people." "I'm important," Selira said mildly, "and I'll be there. I think you should join me." The promenade impossibly got quieter. Theo was pretty sure several delegates had stopped breathing entirely. "That's not how this works," Theo said weakly. "There are rules, protocols. I can't just—" "I'm the sovereign monarch of the Illyrian Empire," Selira interrupted. "I can rewrite protocols before breakfast if it pleases me. Consider this an official invitation." She leaned in slightly, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Besides, I'm curious. You're the first person in years to treat me like an actual person instead of a walking treaty. I'd like to see if that continues when you're not terrified." "I'm terrified right now," Theo pointed out. "Yes, but you're still talking. Most people faint." She straightened, addressing the room at large. "You may rise." The assembled crowd stood as one, though they kept their gazes lowered. The sentinels remained kneeling until Selira made a slight gesture, at which point they rose smoothly and took up positions around her. She turned back to Theo, who was still trying to process that this was actually happening, and not some elaborate stress-induced hallucination brought on by too much time in the maintenance shafts. "The banquet begins at sunset station time," she said. "The Grand Oriole. Don't be late, and please, do something about the lubricant on your face. You look like you've been wrestling with a fusion core." "I was fixing a relay," Theo said automatically. "Then you're perfect. Most of the people attending tonight have never fixed anything in their lives." She smiled again, that same dangerous, amused smile. "I think you'll be a fascinating addition to the evening." Before he could respond, she turned and glided away, her silver robes flowing behind her like liquid starlight. The sentinels fell into formation around her, and the crowd parted like a tide, everyone bowing as she passed. Theo stood alone in the middle of the promenade, very aware that everyone was now staring at him instead of her. A Vetchin delegate clicked his mandibles in what might have been disapproval or possibly curiosity. One of the Kryn soldiers gave him a look that suggested he just won some kind of cosmic lottery and should probably run before the universe corrected its mistake. Theo looked down at his grease-stained coveralls, his battered tool belt, his completely inappropriate everything. "I'm going to need better clothes," he said to no one in particular. Theo had never owned formal wear. He'd attended exactly one wedding in his life, and he'd worn a borrowed jacket that smelled like someone else's cologne. For the banquet, he'd managed to requisition a station uniform from the quartermaster, technically meant for senior staff, but the quartermaster owed him a favor after Theo had fixed the man's personal quarters when the heating system had decided to turn his room into a sauna. The uniform was black, crisp, and made him look like he might actually belong somewhere important. It was also slightly too tight in the shoulders, but Theo figured that was the least of his problems. The Grand Oriole was not a room. It was a statement. The hall stretched at least 200 meters, its walls composed entirely of transparent aluminum that looked out onto the starfield beyond. No station lights, no running lights from passing ships, just the raw, infinite scatter of distant suns. The floor was polished to a mirror shine, some kind of composite that caught and reflected the starlight until it seemed like you were walking through space itself. Theo stood at the entrance, frozen, while a Myrene attendant checked his name against a holographic list that floated in the air beside her crystalline hand. "Harver Theo," she said, her voice chiming like struck glass, "guest of her sovereignty." She looked up at him, her faceted eyes refracting his image into a dozen tiny reflections. "You're seated at the high table." "There's been a mistake," Theo said immediately. "No mistake. Please proceed." She gestured toward the hall, where hundreds of delegates were already seated at long tables that seemed to hover a few centimeters above the floor. Theo could see the anti-gravity generators underneath, subtle and elegant. Someone had spent a fortune making this room feel weightless. He walked forward, trying not to look as terrified as he felt, eyes turned toward him. Not all of them, but enough. A human trade envoy he vaguely recognized leaned toward her companion and whispered something. A Thalorian ambassador's bioluminescent patterns shifted to a curious yellow-green. Theo kept his eyes forward and tried to remember how to walk like a normal person. The high table was elevated on a platform at the far end of the hall, facing the rest of the assembly. It was smaller, more intimate, with only a dozen seats. Selira sat at the center, her silver robes replaced now with something darker, midnight blue that seemed to drink the starlight. Her long ears were adorned with thin circlets of what looked like woven platinum. She saw him approach and gestured to the empty seat beside her. Theo climbed the steps to the platform, feeling every eye in the room tracking his movement. He sat down carefully, trying not to knock anything over or accidentally commit some kind of diplomatic incident with improper cutlery use. "You cleaned up," Selira observed. "I'm impressed." "I borrowed the uniform," Theo admitted. "It's not really mine. Nothing is really anyone's if you think about it long enough. We're all just borrowing matter from the universe." She picked up a glass of something that glowed faintly blue and took a sip, Try not to look so terrified. You'll give people the wrong impression. What's the right impression? That you're supposed to be here. She set down her glass and turned to face him fully. Tell me, what do you think of the Nexus Spire, structurally speaking? Theo blinked at the question. Honestly, it's a mess. The original construction was solid, but 40 years of modifications and patch jobs have turned the infrastructure into a nightmare. The power grid routes through 17 different junction points when it should only need 7. The atmospheric processors are running at 130% capacity just to keep up with standard load. And don't get me started on the waste reclamation system. Celira smiled. You don't like inefficiency. I don't like things that break when they don't have to. Someone designed this station to last centuries, and then everyone who came after decided to ignore the original plans and just bolt things on wherever they felt like it. It's disrespectful to the station, to the engineering, to the people who built it right the first time. Celira studied him for a moment, and Theo realized he'd probably just said something weird. People didn't usually care about the feelings of inanimate objects, but she didn't laugh at him. Instead, she nodded slowly. I think we have similar frustrations, she said. Different contexts, same principle. Before Theo could ask what she meant, servers appeared. Human, Illyrian, and several species he didn't recognize, carrying trays of food that looked more like art installations than meals. Something that might have been protein, but was arranged in a tower of geometric shapes. A soup that changed colors as you looked at it. Fruit from a dozen different worlds, some of it moving slightly on its own. Theo picked up his fork and tried to look like he knew what he was doing. The meal progressed in waves, each course more elaborate than the last. Celira engaged him in conversation between bites, asking questions about his work, his background, why he'd ended up on the Nexus Spire. Theo answered honestly, because lying to a galactic monarch seemed like a bad survival strategy. He told her about his training on Europa, about the contractor who'd hired him for this job, about the time he'd accidentally vented an entire cargo bay's atmosphere because he'd mixed up 2 identical-looking valve controls. No one was in there, right? Celira asked. No, thankfully, but my supervisor didn't speak to me for a month. Good. Mistakes are only interesting if you survive them. Around them, the other occupants of the high table made polite conversation. Theo recognized a few: a Vetchan trade minister, an Illyrian military commander whose armor was so decorated it looked like a jewelry store had exploded on his chest, a human ambassador from the core worlds whose expression suggested he'd bitten into something sour. That one kept glancing at Theo with barely concealed confusion. Halfway through the 4th course, the Vetchan minister, whose name Theo hadn't caught, turned to Celira and clicked his mandibles sharply. Your sovereignty, he said, his voice buzzing through his translator. If I may speak plainly. You may, Celira replied, setting down her glass. The presence of this individual at the high table is highly irregular. I intend no offense to him personally. If we abandon protocol, we abandon the structures that maintain peace between our peoples. Celira leaned back in her chair. An interesting theory, but consider this. Every protocol, every structure, every tradition we hold sacred was created by someone. Usually someone with power deciding how everyone else should behave. And those structures persist not because they're inherently correct, but because people are afraid to question them. She paused, letting that sink in. I am not afraid. And if my choice to share this table with someone who treats me as a person rather than a symbol threatens your sense of order, perhaps your order is more fragile than you'd like to admit. Kethix's mandibles snapped shut. Around the table, no one moved. Theo, because apparently his brain had completely given up on self-preservation, leaned forward slightly. Plus, he said, if we're talking about asses and assumptions, maybe the problem isn't who's at the table but who's decided they get to guard it. The silence that followed was absolute. Theo immediately regretted speaking. This was it. This was how he died, executed for bad wordplay at a diplomatic function. and then Selira laughed. Not politely, not the careful, measured laugh of someone observing protocol, but a genuine, delighted laugh that rang through the Grand Oriole like a bell. The effect was immediate. Tension drained from the table. The Illyrian commander smirked. Even the sour-faced human ambassador's expression cracked slightly. Kethix said nothing, but his mandibles remained firmly closed. Selira turned to Theo, her amber eyes bright with amusement. "I'm going to keep you around," she said. "You're far too entertaining to waste on maintenance work." "I'm good at maintenance work," Theo protested weakly. "I'm sure you are, but I think I have a better use for you." She raised her glass. "We'll discuss it later. For now, enjoy the meal." "You've earned it." Theo picked up his own glass, still not entirely sure what had just happened, but fairly certain his life had just changed direction in a way he couldn't predict. Around them, conversation resumed, quieter now, more cautious. The stars wheeled slowly beyond the transparent walls, indifferent to the small human drama playing out inside. Theo took a sip of his drink. It tasted like citrus and starlight, and decided that if he was going to stumble into galactic politics by accident, he might as well see where it led. The banquet had ended 3 hours ago, but Theo was still aboard the station, standing in a corridor outside the engineering bay, trying to process the fact that his life had apparently taken a hard left turn into territory he couldn't have predicted with a quantum computer. Selira had asked him to meet her at the docking arm where her ship was berthed. Not ordered, asked, which somehow made it worse. He changed back into his coveralls. The borrowed uniform had been returned to the quartermaster, who'd given him a look that suggested rumors had already spread through the entire station. Twice. The docking arm was quieter than the rest of the Nexus spire, reserved for high-priority vessels. The Aversong occupied Bay 7, and Theo could see it through the observation windows as he approached. The ship was beautiful in a way that made his engineer's brain ache with envy. Illyrian design was all curves and flowing lines, organic where human ships were angular and mechanical. The hull seemed to shimmer like mother of pearl, reflecting colors that shouldn't exist. A sentinel stood guard at the airlock. He didn't stop Theo, just nodded and stepped aside. Apparently he was expected. The interior of the Aversong was even more impressive than the exterior. The corridors were wide, lit by ambient light that seemed to come from the walls themselves. There were no visible panels, no exposed conduits, no utilitarian brutalism. Everything was integrated, elegant, impossibly clean. Theo wanted to take the whole ship apart just to understand how it worked. "You're staring," Selira's voice came from behind him. He turned. She'd changed clothes again, now wearing something simpler, practical. Dark pants, a fitted jacket, her hair loose around her shoulders. She looked less like a monarch and more like a person who happened to own 70-star systems. "It's a beautiful ship," Theo said. "I can't figure out where the power conduits are. They're everywhere. The hull itself is a conductor. The entire vessel is one integrated system. Very efficient, very difficult to repair if something breaks." She walked past him, gesturing for him to follow. "Come, I want to show you something." She led him through corridors that curved and branched in ways that made no geometric sense until they emerged onto what Theo realized was an observation deck. The room was small, intimate, with a transparent floor and ceiling that made it feel like they were floating in open space. The Nexus spire hung to one side, a massive geometric flower of metal and lights. Beyond it, the stars stretched forever. Selira stood at the center of the room, her hands clasped behind her back, looking out at the void. 4 years ago," she said, "I inherited an empire I didn't ask for. My predecessor, my father, ruled for 63 years. He was a good monarch, firm, fair, respected. When he died, the transition of power was seamless. No conflict, no dispute. Everyone accepted me because that's what protocol demanded." She turned to face Theo. "And from that moment on, no one has spoken to me without fear or calculation. Every word is measured, every gesture rehearsed. I am surrounded by people who would die for me, but none of them would dare laugh at my jokes. Do you make jokes? Theo asked. Not anymore. There's no point when no one laughs. She smiled sadly. I rule billions, Theo. I command fleets that could reduce entire worlds to ash. I hold more power than most species will ever accumulate. And I am completely, utterly alone. Theo didn't know what to say to that. He'd never thought about what it meant to be that powerful, that isolated. He'd always assumed people at the top had everything figured out. That's why you invited me to the banquet, he said slowly. Not because I'm special. Because I didn't know who you were, partly. But also because when you did know, you still treated me like a person. You made a stupid joke about traffic. You argued with a veteran minister on my behalf using terrible wordplay. You didn't collapse into formality the moment you realized who I was. She took a step closer. Do you understand how rare that is? I was just terrified, Theo admitted. Yes, but you were honest about it. Everyone else hides their fear behind protocol. You wore yours on your face and kept talking anyway. She gestured to the space around them. The Illyrian Empire is suffocating under the weight of its own traditions. We've become so formal, so rigid that we've forgotten how to be spontaneous, how to laugh, how to connect with each other as anything other than positions and titles. And you think I can fix that? Theo asked. I'm just an engineer. You're someone who sees broken systems and wants to repair them. That's exactly what I need. Selira's expression grew serious. I want to offer you a position. Cultural liaison, I'm calling it, though I'm inventing the title as we speak. Your job would be to travel with me, to help me bridge the gap between the Illyrian court and the broader galaxy. To remind my people that humanity, all of humanity, every species, is more than just protocol and procedure. Theo stared at her. You want me to be what exactly? A court jester. If that's how you want to think of it. Though I prefer to think of you as someone who tells the truth when everyone else is lying through their teeth. She smiled. You'd have access to resources, travel, experiences most people never get. You'd also be putting yourself in the middle of galactic politics, which is occasionally dangerous and frequently tedious. But I think you'd be good at it. And I think I'd enjoy having someone around who isn't afraid to call me out when I'm being ridiculous. Are you ever ridiculous? Constantly. I'm a monarch. It comes with the crown. Theo looked out at the stars, at the Nexus spire, at the vast empty spaces between everything. He thought about his life before this, the endless cycle of maintenance and repairs, the loneliness of working in service corridors while important people made important decisions somewhere else. He'd been invisible for so long that he'd forgotten what it felt like to be seen. Can I still fix things? He asked. The Aversong's systems, I mean. If something breaks, if you can figure out how they work, you can fix whatever you want. Then yes, I'll do it. He turned to face her. But I'm going to need better clothes, and maybe some kind of manual on diplomatic protocol so I don't accidentally start a war. Selira laughed, and it was the same bright, unguarded sound from the banquet. I'll provide the clothes. As for protocol, I think we'll make it up as we go. That's the whole point. They stood together on the observation deck, two people from completely different worlds looking out at the galaxy. Thea felt something shift inside him, something he couldn't quite name. Purpose, maybe. Or just the simple relief of being acknowledged as more than background noise. You know, he said after a moment, those Kryn soldiers weren't wrong. You do have the most beautiful ass in the galaxy. Selira's eyebrows rose. That's remarkably bold for someone who just accepted a job from me. You said you wanted honesty. I did, didn't I? She shook her head, still smiling. This is either going to be the best decision I've ever made or the absolute worst. Probably both, Theo said. Probably. She extended her hand, formal but friendly. Welcome aboard, Theo Harver. Try not to break anything important. He shook her hand. Her grip was firm, warm, human despite everything else. No promises, he said, but I'll do my best. Outside, the stars wheeled slowly in their ancient dance, indifferent to the small, strange moment happening inside the Aversong. a queen and an engineer, laughing together in the dark.